This is the X-Zone Broadcast Network, broadcasting worldwide on broadcast affiliates and satellite program providers, including CNN Broadcast Network, Sirius Satellite Network, Star Media, Good News Radio Network, Angel Broadcast Network, Wiki Broadcast Network, and WPBN TV. For more information on the X-Zone Broadcast Network, visit us at www.xzbn.net.
Unwilling to be the government's deadly assassin, gifted psychic Kahara Mitchell went AWOL and ended up buried under rubble in the wake of a great tsunami. She regained consciousness far from Earth on the medical ship of a Daguerreonian intergalactic fleet. Has she been rescued or abducted by aliens? The Chalice of Carrie, Kahira O'Donnell's latest paranormal science fiction romance, is the passionate story of an Earth woman and her destined mates, twin kings from another galaxy. Kahara uses her gifts fighting alongside Lords Rom and Ra in a war that will determine the destiny of galaxies. The Chalice of Carrie by Kahira O'Donnell is now available at KahiraO'Donnell.com or at Amazon.com.
All Hit Radio.
Welcome to the X Zone, a place where fact is fiction and fiction is reality. Now, here's your host, Rob McConnell.
And welcome back to the X-Zone, everyone. My name is Rob McConnell. We're coming to you from our broadcast center in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. If you'd like to send us an email, xzone@xzoneradiotv.com, and you can always listen to the X-Zone Radio Show 724-365 at www.xzoneradiotv.com. And don't forget, you can also call us worldwide toll-free at 1-800-610-7035 and on all social media sites, X-Zone Radio TV. My guest this hour, X-Zone Nation, is Todde C. Elliott. We're going to be talking about Todde's new book, The Axes of Evil, the true story of the Axeman murders. Now, the Axeman murders in 1912 in Louisiana and Texas leave a bloody trail of evidence that points to the largest unsolved serial killing in the history of the United States. It's a tale of ritual murder, voodoo, mayhem, and wholesale killings that leads you, the reader, on a shocking train ride across 2 states and into the chapters of real American horror stories. The fiendish slaying of 10 sleeping families nestled in their beds is only the beginning of this terrifying account of true crime that remains unsolved. Joining me now is the author of this fascinating book, Todde C. Clark. Once again, the name of the book is The Axes of Evil, the true story of the Axeman murders. And Todde Clark, welcome to the X-Zone.
Hey, Rob. Thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
My God, Todde, you've certainly done a lot. I was reading your bio, and some of you. How many articles have you published over the years? Like, you're a journalist yourself. You've taken mass communication at McNeese State University in Lake Charles. My goodness. How did you get started in journalism? I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I guess I started in journalism at probably 6th grade in Louisiana. I started reviewing Saturday morning cartoons. That was back when cartoons were relegated to Saturday mornings. Now they're 24/7. But I just started, I guess, from an early age, and I still do radio as well. Mm-hmm. So I started making tapes when I was a kid and just sort of doing my own work. And actually, this book is kind of the culmination of about 15 years of just a hobby of mine, right. Really sort of an obsession. that I had about this story, and I never anticipated that it would be a book, certainly. But I'm really thankful for, Peter Levinda for writing the foreword to this book, and my publisher Robert Milligan at Trine Day for really believing in the project and my work.
What was it about this story that captivated you as a youth, and even until today, until the point when you actually decided to write a book about it?
Yeah, well, I think the main thing that attracted me to it was that one of the most horrific murders that the Axeman ever committed was in my hometown of Lake Charles, Louisiana. And when I was, it was in the late 1990s, and I read a book by an author, the last name Newton, and his book was called Raising Hell, an encyclopedia of satanic crime. And I started with it was written in 1998, and it was written in encyclopedia form, so it started with the A's. So right from the beginning of Newton's book, I came across the word axe, and I started there, and I was shocked to learn that, this horrific unsolved crime actually, took place in my hometown. And Lake Charles was the only crime scene of all the crime scenes where the killer left a message. Now, not a clue. There were probably many, many clues left at the crime scenes across Louisiana, but in Lake Charles, this was the only place where the killer left a message on the family's back door. Now, it was a family of 5, and there was Felix Broussard, the Broussard family. They were murdered in their sleep in the comfort of their own bed, and never roused from sleep, apparently. And neighbors never heard anything, no witnesses. And the killer's message left on the back door was from the Book of Psalms, chapter 9, and it read, "When he maketh the inquisition for blood, he forgetteth not the cry of the humble." And I thought that it was strange. This is what got me thinking, was how was this a satanic crime? Then it was categorized as a satanic crime by the author of that book, but it always struck me as maybe it wasn't. Why would a satanic criminal or a Satanist even leave a biblical quote from the Old Testament? It just didn't make a lot of sense to me. So that sort of got my wheels turning. And over the years, it was a hobby of mine, and it took a lot of trips to various libraries and research. And when you're interviewing, you can't really, there's not many people to interview.
That's right.
With a crime that's 100 years old. But what I found shocking was that
Todd, we've got to take our break here. Please stand by. Exonation. Todd C. Clark's our special guest this hour. Axis of Evil, the true story of the Axeman murders. We'll be back on the other side of this break. Don't go away. How would you like to be able to read other people's minds? Well, the next best thing is here. When you know how to read a person's name, you know how the person thinks, feels, and behaves. Each letter in our name holds a key to unlock our true essence. Our name contains both our gifts and challenges in this lifetime. Mnemology science discovers personality secrets hidden in the placement of the letters of our names, including the first and last impression people remember about us. Sharon shows us how to interpret the arrangement of letters as outlined in her book, Know the Name, Know the Person. Sharon Lynn Wyeth created mnemology science after 18 years of research and testing her theories, and has supported thousands of people around the world in understanding themselves and others better. You'll enjoy Sharon's unique teachings as she shares her system to learn the gifts behind your given birth name. Even if you don't like your birth name, there are jewels in this book. If you're thinking of changing your name, ready to name your child, or wanting to get along better with others, this is the book for you. If you'd like to improve your relationships and change your life for the better, get the book today, Know the Name, Know the Person, or visit www.knowthename.com. That's www.knowthename.com. Rob McConnell here, presenting an overview for Nicholas Paul Jennings, author of a fascinating book, Amen. It presents facts revealed by Egyptologists, facts that enable us to understand why Amen is the beginning of creation of God. It provides recommendations for religious leaders of the major religions to unify their beliefs and teach the Word of God. Love one another. Amen informs people how mankind conceived God. It was the Egyptians that developed the concepts of a soul, a hereafter, and Son of God. And finally, after the worship of many gods, they conceived the belief in one universal God, the maker of all there is. For more information, visit www.futureofgodamen.com. That's www.futureofgodamen.com.
I'm William S. Peckham. If you enjoy a good mystery with a touch of the paranormal, then you'll love my novel, From Out of the Woodwork. It's the story of a young Toronto contractor, Sean Kennedy, who buys derelict homes, guts them, and turns them into multi-family dwellings. Slums just waiting to happen. When Sean buys 29 Livery Lane, the house fights back. Former owners unexpectedly come out of the woodwork as he starts the destruction. The apparitions come to him when he touches old books, reads hidden letters, rummages through old boxes, finds a locket, or reads a discovered manuscript of a murder mystery. From Out of the Woodwork will take you from 1899 to the horror of the World Trade Center, September 11, 2001. Check out From Out of the Woodwork on my website, www.williamspeckham.com.
Welcome back to the X Zone, everyone. My name is Rob McConnell. We're coming to you from our broadcast center in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. This is Real Radio, and I'm going to give you a perfect example of why it's Real Radio. My guest's name is not Todd Clark, it's Todd C. Elliott. So to Todd and to you, the listeners, my apologies. I guess that I was thinking about Arthur C. Clarke and Todd C. Clarke. And anyway, yeah. Todd C. Elliott is our very special guest. He's the author of Axis of Evil, the true story of the Axeman murders. All right, Todd, let's go back to the year when these crimes occurred. How did law enforcement try to solve these crimes? And you know, we as we were leaving the last segment, you said, why, if this was classified as a satanic event or a satanic crime, why would the perpetrator or perpetrators leave a biblical notation on the back door? And during the break, I had an idea that maybe it was to throw law enforcement off, that this was a false lead. And maybe there was a connection to the sinister forces that are well known in the Louisiana area, for example, as satanic cults, voodoo, and so on.
Sure, yeah. The other detail about the biblical quote that was left behind, and that is a plausible explanation, but the law enforcement didn't deem any crime, especially murder, could be deemed satanic by anyone of any theological belief. But the law enforcement were convinced that it was a, quote, religious fanatic. And they never used satanic, but they always said religious fanatic. There was something of a religious nature to the crimes that they were seeing. Now, these crimes were occurring in Lafayette, Louisiana, and Crowley, Louisiana in 1911. And then in 1912, the killer revisited Crowley and Lafayette. And after the second time that a family was killed in Lafayette, Louisiana, there was actually an arrest made. And it was actually a woman. So people started thinking that the Axeman was a woman. And not only that, the crimes after this woman was arrested and being held in Lafayette, the crimes continued once again into Crowley and then into Lake Charles, which I brought you to when I said that the killers left a message, the biblical quote, and also left behind on the side of the quote, on the biblical quote, was the words "human five," as if it were written by the Human Five, or there was this cult called the Human Five. And if it was not indeed the woman who was arrested, she was an African-American woman by the name of Clementine Barnabette. She eventually ended up confessing to 17 of these murders and these crimes in gruesome detail that really authorities thought that only she could have known. And she was mixed up in a church that was out of New Orleans, and they were called the Church of the Sacrifice. And there was a group that was doing revivals across Louisiana at the time, and they were called the Sanctified Sect. Now, every town that they would travel to, usually within a day or two, there would be a gruesome murder discovery.
Wow.
And the first people who were arrested were actually 3 of them were preachers and reverends of this church affiliated with, and this church was rumored to have voodoo ties out of New Orleans. And this woman, Clementine Barnabette, said that she had actually, her and several others had purchased voodoo conjas. She called them conjas, which were basically charms, spells of protection. And she was trying to achieve what she believed was immortality by taking these other lives. But after she was arrested, the crimes continued. So it couldn't have been Clementine Barnabette, or if it was possibly other members of the, quote, Human Five, then maybe they were trying to exonerate her and maybe help her to beat the rap and get her off the charge, but that never happened. Now, from 1911 to 1912, by the time the killer entered Texas in 1912, there had already been 36 deaths. And these are women and children and babies, small children, entire families. Now, that's the difference about the modern serial killer, or the people that we think of when we think serial killer. We think Jeffrey Dahmer,
right?
We think Ted Bundy, and John Wayne Gacy and people like that. But this killer had already killed 36 in a year, and I mean that actually rivals the number of Ted Bundy and Gacy and Dahmer all combined. And the most horrific thing about the Axeman was that he was a wholesale killer. He was killing entire families. We typically relate to serial killers by their individual victims, and we could name this person and that person, and one instance and one night this happened. But this was going on from town to town, and sometimes within a period of 48 hours. Families were all being murdered, in their sleep, in their bed, and the crime scene was always the same. The axe was always found, usually under the bed or in the bedroom of the victims. Now, someone asked one time, well, why did the killer use an axe? Why not a knife or a gun? They certainly had those back then. And what the law enforcement was able to determine back then was that the killer was traveling by rail. All the attacks were near a train depot or station, and most of the train tracks are still out there today. And you can go and look in the old neighborhoods, and they came eerily close to the victims' homes and things like that. But the killer was a passenger, and the killer never brought the axe on board the train. Now, you have to think in 1911 and 1912, if you wanted heat and if you wanted, to do cooking, you had to have a wood pile out back,
right.
And an axe was a necessary tool. So the killer would go and rely on the axe of the family to be there, and would always use that axe against the family and murder them in their sleep. Now, when I was doing my research, I was actually shocked to learn that initially, I thought it was only Louisiana and Texas. And then through my research, even after, I started writing the book, and I have to make a disclaimer too, because there's a television show called American Horror Story, and they touch on the Axeman of New Orleans with the Axeman Jazz. This is not the same Axeman. That Axeman was actually a copycat killer who came along probably about 6 or 7 years later. But I appreciate the American Horror Story TV show, and at least they sort of generated some interest in the Axeman. And while I was writing it, I thought it was kind of lucky that there was this interest in crimes of yesteryear, and especially axe murders. But I got to say, it's probably the most horrific thing that I've ever written. And what I'm thinking it is now, after learning all that I've learned, that this is the American Jack the Ripper of the 20th century. And this, I believe, is the largest unsolved serial killing in American history, because for some reason, in 1911 and 1912, there were a great number of axe murders, same MO, same nearly identical crime scene across the country. For some reason, families all across the country.
Todd, are you there?
Were being murdered in their sleep, and it was never the motive. And it appeared to be that, we have something that we call down here in Louisiana snowbirds, and those are basically people who are from up north and they come down south during the winter, and then what struck me is that all the killings in the south actually occurred during the winter, and then during the summer months, the killer would go back and be up north killing. And I had no idea even about the Villisca axe murders until I started writing my book. And the Villisca axe murders are like one of the greatest unsolved crimes in American history and most gruesome. And when I read the Villisca account of the crime scene, I mean, I was shocked. I had already been working for years and studying and just kind of researching the Axeman. And when I read what happened in Villisca, I immediately, it dawned on me that this was the same guy. I mean, it was the same exact crime scene. Axe was left behind.
Could it have been could it have been a copycat?
It could have been a copycat killer, but the thing is, it was too. I mean, you could almost follow the killer's trail by the train tracks.
All right, so if this crime is still unsolved 100 years later, why didn't law enforcement of the day use due diligence in their investigation and come up with the same conclusions that you've come up with? Or was the information not accessible to law enforcement 100 years ago?
I don't think that a lot of it was accessible. What's interesting is I've talked to experts on the Villisca case, and Dr. Ed Epperly, who was really instrumental in my chapter on Villisca. I mean, he is the world expert on the Villisca axe murders. He had no idea that there were killings in Louisiana and Texas.
Wow.
He'd heard some, but he never knew about the Axeman, and he calls it the Gulf Coast murders. But he had no clue. And I mean, if you just take a step back and you don't look at it as, regional history like Louisiana history or the state of Iowa, because that's Villisca, Iowa. I didn't know anything about Villisca, Iowa, or even Iowa history. But if you step back from, your states, and you just look at what's going on in the country, I mean, it was alarming how many families were killed in their sleep, by the same means, almost identical crime scene in every single crime scene.
Now, these families that were murdered, was there any racial connection?
Well, there was in Louisiana and Texas. Now, for some reason, there was a belief that Clementine Barnabette, who was the African American, the woman who was arrested and tried, that they were off. This church was hell-bent, and they were sort of preaching racial impurity. Now, the victims in all these families were considered to be what people would call mulatto, and some people find that offensive word, and it's all over the newspapers of yesteryear. Yeah. That's just what they used. But, I mean, they were saying half-white or near-white families. So they were mixed-race families that were the victims.
Sounds like somebody was trying to get rid of this in-between state.
It was something like that. It had to do something with that. Yeah. And this church was preaching, there was a lot going on in the country and the world at the time. Eugenics was just starting to take off. There was even a tie-in to a book that was going around back then in 1912 called the Book of Moses. And when I first read that, I was like, the Book of Moses, I mean, it struck me as like, that's not even a book in the Bible. But it was basically a sort of Judeo-Christian book of magic and incantations, things like that were going around, basically Judeo-Christian magic. And this was becoming very, very popular. It had stemmed from, I think, Germanic origins, and was
all right. Todd, we're going to have to we have to take our news break here at the bottom of the hour. Exo Nation, okay. Todd C. Elliott is our guest of this hour on Facebook, facebook.com/The Axis of Evil Book. That's The Axis of Evil Book. And the name of the book that we're talking about, The Axis of Evil, the true story of the Axeman murders. My name is Rob McConnell. We'll be back. Modern Esoteric, Beyond Our Senses by Brad Olson, consummates the lifology story about where humanity originates. It is the lost continents, the primitive wisdom, the mythos of creation, and the rethinking of ancient history as we are taught in academia. There is much more to the story than what we have been told. As this is the first book in the Esoteric series, Modern Esoteric starts at the beginning of time and accelerates up to this modern age. Future Esoteric is book 2 in the series and takes a forward-looking position ahead of today with an open and honest examination of the ET issue and various unexplained phenomena. To discover the writings of author Brad Olson, visit www.bradolson.com. That's www.bradolson.com. Do you think you have energy problems in your home? Do you feel better when you're away than when you're home? Joey Korn is a global leader in the world of dowsing who specializes in personal energy clearing and space clearing. He can help you create an ideal energy environment in your home no matter where you live in the world. Learn about his remote spiritual house cleaning services and much more at www.dowsers.com. You can get Joey's book, Dowsing, A Path to Enlightenment, as well as other dowsing books and tools, Kabbalah books, and Walter Russell books. Joey's work is really amazing. Go to dowsers.com right now. That's DOWSERS.com or call 1-877-DOWSING. That's 1-877-369-7464. With each new extreme weather event or terrorist act, it becomes increasingly obvious that we live in uncertain and challenging times. We all buy car insurance. Why not collapse and catastrophe insurance? Matthew Stein, an MIT-trained engineer and green builder, has written 2 outstanding books to help people prepare, plan for, and deal with everything from minor situations lasting a few days to full-on collapse. Matt's first book, When Technology Fails, is a manual for self-reliance, sustainable living, and surviving the long emergency. This massive book covers the gamut from first aid and emergency preparedness to alternative healing, renewable energy, primitive living skills, and 18th century technologies that could be critical to your comfort and survival in a long-lasting crisis. Matt's second book, When Disaster Strikes, is a comprehensive emergency preparedness handbook and survival guide. When Disaster Strikes is an essential item for every family's go bag. Both books are available at all usual sources. There's a wealth of totally free information posted at whentechfails.com, and author-signed copies may be purchased at mattstein.com. That's www.whentechfails.com and www.mattstein.com. Todde C. Elliott is my guest this hour. Exonation. He's the author of Axes of Evil, the true story of the Axeman murders. On Facebook, you can follow Todde at facebook.com/The Axes of Evil book. That's facebook.com/The Axes of Evil book. All right, Todde, so I understand that in your book you point to a possible suspect. In fact, you're convinced that the Reverend Kelly is responsible for all the murders around the country.
Right.
Why?
I believe that. Well, people ask me that, and mainly because he was a central figure, a main suspect, if you will, in the Villisca axe murders, and one of the only people ever brought to trial in that case. Now, the reason I believe he did it is because he said he did it. He confessed. He confessed during his trial, and then, for some reason, recanted.
But didn't the other lady who you were talking about in the previous segment also admit to all these murders? And the murders continued after she died. So could this be another copycat case?
It could be, but it could also be that that Reverend Kelly
Mm-hmm.
could have also been affiliated through the ties of the church and a traveling minister.
Mm-hmm.
It's very possible that he could have been affiliated with the Sacrifice Church out of New Orleans. What
But-
was interesting about both churches
Mm-hmm.
is they preached sacrifice and the importance of sacrifice and blood sacrifice.
Right, but in
Now-
your research, was there
Mm-hmm.
any proof that you were able to find that on a certain date and time in a area or in a town
Mm-hmm.
where these murders were committed that Reverend Kelly was in that town?
No, it's the only trace that I found of Reverend Kelly in Texas. I only found an evidence of him in Texas, and the fact that even to this day, there's a book in the library in the Texas university system. The only published book that Kelly ever written is in Texas for some reason. Now, this is an English immigrant who came to the United States at the turn of the century, and the thing is, he confessed. And the thing about the dates, now, none of the dates of all of these murders across the country in nearly every state, none of the dates ever overlap. There's never any dates that stick out as saying it couldn't have been possible, because, all these were towns along a train rail, a train
Okay.
service. And like I said, you could almost map out how the killer traveled by rail.
Yeah.
Now, I think that Kelly could have been affiliated with Clementine Barnabette. She could have been lying, and maybe Kelly was even the leader of this human five. But I just found it interesting that the message left in Lake Charles was a biblical quote, and it was one that Kelly was pretty keen on, and preaching sacrifice and things like that between the two churches and Kelly's beliefs. I found it too coincidental that, all the crime scenes are nearly identical. Robbery was never the motive. Kelly admitted. Clementine Barnabette also admitted. And, if one of them, say if Clementine Barnabette is lying, or if I'm wrong that this isn't the largest unsolved serial killing in U.S. history, then it touches on an interesting fact. There's a great injustice here. Neither one of Clementine, if she didn't do it, ended up in prison, and she died in Angola prison in Louisiana. Kelly, on the other hand, who admitted doing it as well, got sent to a mental institution, but not for the axe murders. But he did not ever, he was not ever brought to justice. And after he was put on probation and under the scrutiny of, officials in the state of Iowa at the time, magically, all of the axe murders that had been running rampant across the country, they stopped by about 1915, and they never happened again. But I discovered that there were axe murders happening in this fashion even before 1911. Even in 1910, the killer had struck in 1910 in Lake Charles, and even after 1912, and I didn't even know that. I didn't even know that. I didn't even know about Villisca, but his testimony is pretty shocking, to say the least. He actually believed that God told him to do all of these criminal acts. And, what the law enforcement were seeing and they were after was a religious fanatic. Kelly definitely fit that description. He was definitely, I think, criminally insane. He admitted to it. Now, we also see the early the trace beginnings of CSI crime scene investigation. You have chemists being brought in to test blood samples found as evidence in some of the crime scenes. So it's interesting there, but law enforcement were really baffled by this. They had never seen anything like this before. And some of the things that they were seeing were pretty gruesome, and the kind of things that you would expect from, like Hannibal Lecter or Hollywood fiction, but this was real. This was the real the true American horror story. But the things that they were seeing in Texas and Louisiana were that the victims, the families, were post-mortem being posed and arranged in, positions to, give the appearance of a religious motif. In fact, there was one family in Crowley, Louisiana, that their children had been, bludgeoned to death with the axe. And the axe man also didn't always use the sharp end of the axe. He also often used the flat end to just smash the victims a lot of the times. And what the killer did in Crowley, Louisiana, was left 2 children in the bed and positioned the dead mother and father at the foot of the bed on their knees in a prayer position. And this was shocking to police. I mean, this would still be shocking today. That's just it. If the Axeman were around today, going around from town to town, killing entire families in their sleep, our communities would be on edge, and they were back then. And these were turn-of-the-century people, and we can relate, I think, because we are turn-of-the-century people. It was just 100 years ago, but some things have never changed. And a lot of people have never even heard this part of American history, and I like to unearth this kind of history, you know.
Why?
And I think it's the story that no one wants to talk about, or they haven't wanted to talk about for 100 years because it touches on religion, it touches on race. Still hot button issues in America.
I understand that, but aren't certain things better left alone?
I don't know. I think people appreciate a good mystery, and it still is to me. And you know, I mean, if you glean something from it, and even if it's just entertainment, I think your history should be entertaining. It's you know, even if it's I don't know if there's a lesson to be learned, but there's a great injustice, I think, in Reverend Kelly never being brought to justice. I don't think some people would be surprised at that, and the fact I supposed in the book, it was a theory of mine that he was a Freemason, and I think that's probably how he got off and sort of escaped justice, really. But it says something about the American justice system as well. I think it's a commentary on that as well.
All right, but just based on what you've said about Reverend Kelly, since there is no direct evidence linking him to these crimes, maybe he did do some crimes, traveling along the rails back in the early 1900s. There were a lot of hobos, a lot of vagabonds who would go from city to city. And I agree with you that everyone needed a pile of wood because in the rural areas, in the smaller communities, they didn't have, coal. And at that time, the interior early day furnaces were just coming into effect. But I'm trying to understand your jump in reasoning and logic of connecting Reverend Kelly being this mass murderer. Yeah.
Well, I mean, there was evidence to link him to the Villisca axe murders.
Right.
I mean,
and how
as
many
soon as
people
he left town very early in the morning of the Villisca axe murders, he was talking about the axe murders before people had even read the news, before the news had even broken. And he had laundry that he dropped off with blood stains on it as well. Not only that, I mean, he did confess, but then he said he confessed under duress. And this is a man who had already spent 6 months in the federal loony bin at St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington, D.C. And I mean, he was quite detailed in his confession. And I mean, I'm not sure, if there were any other central figures, but Kelly was certainly capable of traveling across the country.
Yeah, but you see, if you were to tell me, Rob, on such and such a date, in such and such a town, this family was killed, and more than coincidentally, Reverend Kelly was in that same town. Yeah. Then I could understand. The only one that I can point to definitely for sure is Villisca, Iowa. And he had actually attended the church service for that family and watched their children perform during the church service of the children's service. He was there that night. He confessed to it, and he complained that he couldn't sleep later that night. So he saw a shadow out on the lawn in the middle of the night, and he followed it. And the voice told him to go up and slay utterly. Boy. And that was the voice told him to slay utterly and suffer the children unto me. He believed me was God. He believed the voice was God telling him to do these things. Now, that is one instance where you could say Kelly was there the night before. He was there the day before. Right. And he was there in the early morning shortly thereafter. How many murders are we talking all told?
Total.
Yeah.
It's, there's probably, I would nearly 100, if not,
Hmm.
100. I mean, I don't want to, there's a timeline. I had to put a timeline in the book because there are actually so many, but I
Yeah.
mean, it's nearly 100. But then there are also like the indirect victims of the Axeman. For example, in Smithville, Texas, all the communities were so heightened and on edge, paranoid, that people were being killed in the middle of the night, shot,
Caught.
because they were being mistaken for the axe, for whatever reason. But I
Right.
mean, there were indirect victims of the Axeman, as well. And just the heightened fear across the land, I think, really took its toll on a lot of communities. And I think you could still see evidence of that today, even 100 years later,
What's the
because a lot of
what's the connection with voodoo?
well, that was mainly in Louisiana and Texas, where this strange church,
Hmm.
which no one could figure out what they preached on.
Hmm.
They were affiliated with the Sacrifice Church and something called the Black Council of God out of New Orleans. Now, they had been controversial and involved in the death of a policeman, but Clementine Barnabette, basically, she told that, during her testimony while she was on trial, that she believed in the voodoo that was, and she believed that this charm would help her to achieve some sort of immortality. And well, we are talking about her 100 years later, but
Sure.
she believed that that she could do these things and not get caught, and she was I guess, getting some thrill out of it. But she used the voodoo charms, and and a lot of it came from the newspapers. I don't know if the newspapers sensationalized a lot of the stories, but there were a lot of stories, and this was actually these stories were coming out of Louisiana and
Hmm.
Texas. These horrific tales of voodoo, mayhem and murder. They were coming out of Louisiana and Texas, and they were in newspapers across the country. Like the Washington Herald carried it. In fact, the Axeman murders in Texas and Louisiana were the biggest news story on the front page of many, many newspapers across the country up until April of 1912, when the Titanic sunk. I mean, before the Titanic sunk, everyone was talking about these crazy axe murders. And
So it seems
headlines.
that times really haven't changed, because even in today's society, some 100 years later, if it don't bleed, it don't lead.
Well, it's true. And I think initially with, I think the reporting came slow in reporting these deaths, because, they were reporting them initially as just, these were Negro deaths. And the consensus, I guess, in Louisiana, especially in Lafayette, it seems like no one really cared. It
Right.
wasn't really. But then it caught on, and I think it was brought to light by the journalists back then. And I'm thankful that even one out of Utica, New York, was so instrumental in documenting this, that I actually even found photographs. The reporter, the traveling journalist from Utica, New York, did a far better job than any of the Louisiana and Texas reporters, and actually documented with photographic evidence, which is in the book. And there's a lot of the documentation, and just about anything that I could provide in my research is in the book. You even get a look at Clementine Barnabette, a picture of her, and Reverend Kelly. They're all in the book.
Why did you write?
Even on the Kindle version.
Really? So tell me, why did you write this story? Is it because you felt that this was a story that had to be told? Is it because it's an outstanding mystery?
I think it's a little of both.
Okay.
I kind of, in my dedication, I dedicated the book initially to a man that I never met before. I never had the pleasure of meeting, but he was ensconced in this research, and I think he wanted to solve the mystery, and I used a lot of his research, and it was very instrumental. And part of me wanted to do it for Robert Benoit, and because he had started kind of the outline of the story, and really for the 10 sleeping families of Louisiana and Texas that were butchered, I just felt like that it's kind of a shame, and if you can shame someone, I think as evil as Clementine Barnabette or Reverend Kelly, I gain some satisfaction, and hopefully put the souls of these families to rest, once and for all.
All right, Todd, stand by. You and I have to take our final break. Exonation Todde C. Elliott's my special guest. He's the author of Axis of Evil, the true story of the Axeman murders, and we'll be back on the other side of this break as we wrap up this hour here in the X Zone with yours truly, Rob McConnell. Don't go away.
What if someone told you could live to be 120? Would you believe him? What if he told you the Bible guaranteed it? All you needed to do was follow his rules and buy his products. Would you do it? What if you invested 20 years of your life in him? What if he tested his substances on your child? What if your child became brain damaged as a result? Meet Dr. Tyler Belknap, a fast-talking Texas admin turned health guru. At the helm of a vast health food and supplement empire, he has established himself as the authority on nutrition and longevity. But what his followers don't know is that his products are laced with bizarre psychoactive substances from genetically modified plants developed in his very own secret lab. No wonder his customers can't stop using them. Tyler Belknap will stop at nothing to keep his edge in the market, even if it means experimenting on children. Chasing 120, a story of food, faith, fraud, and the pursuit of longevity, a novel from the pen of political cartoonist Monty Wolverton, is an easy and entertaining read full of rich characters and intrigue. It hits home in a world filled with all kind of hucksterism and offers a glimpse of what can happen when GMO technology falls into the wrong hands. Chasing 120 by Monty Wolverton. Get your copy today at www.ptm.org/120 or on Amazon.com.
Nita Hickok is an expert in exorcisms, psychic warfare, soul healing, angelology, soul retrieval, demonology, energy healing, long-distance healing, astral healing, and much more. Nita is an interfaith minister because she believes all gods and goddesses are valid and that they are part of one divine force that is incomprehensible to us who are incarnated upon this earth. Nita has been doing astral healing, distant healing, spirit release, exorcism, house cleansing and blessings, soul restoring and revival, psychic vampire removal and curse removal, and much more for over 40 years. For more information or to contact Nita Hickok, visit her website at www.astralhealer.com. That's www.astralhealer.com.
Rob McConnell here, presenting an overview for Nicholas Paul Jennings, author of a fascinating book, Amen. It presents facts revealed by Egyptologists, facts that enable us to understand why Amen is the beginning of creation of God. It provides recommendations for religious leaders of the major religions to unify their beliefs and teach the Word of God. Love one another. Amen informs people how mankind conceived God. It was the Egyptians that developed the concepts of a soul, a hereafter, and Son of God. And finally, after the worship of many gods, they conceived the belief in one universal God, the maker of all there is. For more information, visit www.futureofgodamen.com. That's www.futureofgodamen.com. Don't forget X Zone Nation, starting in March, the X Zone TV show will be on a small screen in your area. Call up your local cable provider or your local TV station or even your local online provider to find out where you can watch the X Zone TV show. My guest this hour, Todde C. Elliott, is the author of Axes of Evil, the true story of the Axeman murders. His website is his Facebook page at facebook.com/the Axes of Evil book. That's the Axes of Evil book, and it's available also at all online bookstores. When we look back through the ages and the research that you've done, how do you think that this has affected the way law enforcement treats serial killing cases now, here in the 21st century?
Well, I think now they're easier to profile and catch. I think back then, especially even assuming that a reverend or someone of the cloth might even do something like that, I think that was out of the question. I don't think anybody thought that way, and that's why they were so baffled, I think, and shocked by it. But how that's a good question. I mean, how do they catch the next serial killer? I mean, with all the security, I guess with technology, perhaps it might be easier, but I don't know. I believe that right now there's one out there right now that may go on for years and never be caught. And like this killer, that's what makes it so horrific, is this killer went on for years and, in my opinion, never got caught. That's the real horror, is never catching them. And I don't know if you can. I don't know if it's possible. I don't know if law enforcement has become so far advanced. I don't know if a whole lot has changed in 100 years. But you see the early developments of using. I think today you could certainly find more clues. Sure. Back then, I mean, they didn't even really have fingerprint clues and things like that. But I think that when you take a step back and if networking, I think networking is key with law enforcement. I think had more of the law enforcement been instrumental in working together, which we actually did see that probably in the first time in Louisiana and Texas, the law enforcement came together in Beaumont, Texas, and the Lake Charles authorities and the Lafayette sheriffs, and they all came together because they had absolutely no clue. They had nothing, no leads, no witnesses, nothing to work on, and that could still happen today. But I think networking is the way to go, and I think that's, if you take a step back and you look at what's going on, not just in your town or in your state, but what's going on across the country. And I mean, it's kind of a scary picture. If you look at the bigger picture, there's something bigger and scarier happening. And I mean, when I step back and look at it, and I saw all of these, unsolved axe murders from, and it probably goes back in 1909 to about 1913 or 14. I mean, there was really something wrong going on in the United States then. If it was a handful of people or one person, I mean, it was what it was. And I think it's just taking a look at the bigger picture. And, reading my book is definitely one way to help.
All right, Todde, we've run out of time for tonight. I want to thank you so much for joining us. Continued success, and Exonation. My guest this hour has been Todde C. Elliott. He's the author of The Axes of Evil, the true story of the Axeman murders, on Facebook, /the Axes of Evil book. And his book is available as well as on all line bookstores. I'll be back on the other side of this commercial break with the news as we continue here in the X Zone from our broadcast center in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. Don't go away.